Hi class, it's Professor Whitlock. Let's continue our discussion of cinema. In the first segment, you learned some new terminology. You learned about mise-en-scène, you learned about all of the tools that are available to an auteur or the artist of a film to construct meaning in a work of cinema. And you looked at lots of real-world examples, I hope. Now, in this section, I want to introduce you to a specific work of cinema that we will be analyzing together in class. So this film is called Marie Antoinette, and it was directed by Sofia Coppola, and it was made in 2006. Now, you might recognize the name Coppola. Sofia Coppola has a very famous father. His name is Francis Ford Coppola, and he was the director behind all of the Godfather movies. So he was a really big deal, especially in the 1980s. He's kind of like Hollywood royalty. And so for Sofia Coppola to be born into that legacy, you can imagine that it probably had a huge impact on her work as a director. In some ways, it's an advantage. In some ways, it's a disadvantage. So, obviously, she probably has it in her genes to make good movies. I'm sure that her father probably imparted a lot of wisdom. She probably spent time in the midst of movie making growing up, and I'm sure that a lot of that had a huge impact on her development as an artist. On the other hand, you can imagine that a lot of people would just assume that she's very privileged and that she has a lot of advantages and perhaps jump to the conclusion that she's really not a worthy artist and maybe they may dismiss her out of hand just because they're like, oh, the only reason that you got to make that movie was because your dad is Francis Ford Coppola. So it's kind of a mixed bag. And I think that perhaps her position as Francis Ford Coppola's daughter perhaps influenced her to choose this subject matter, Marie Antoinette. And I think that she kind of felt like she could relate to Marie Antoinette in that way, that she maybe has a lot of privileges, a lot of advantages that were just given to her by nature of her birth, but at the same time, those advantages also work against her in certain respects, just like they did with Marie Antoinette. You might be familiar with Sofia Coppola's other works, such as The Virgin Suicides from the year 2000, that starred Kirsten Dunst. Then you have Lost in Translation from 2003. I personally really like this movie a lot. It has Scarlett Johansson and Bill Murray. It's set in Japan, and it's really a neat glimpse into the culture of Japan. I just really enjoyed that aspect of the movie. It's not exactly what you would call a comedy, but, come on. With Bill Murray, it's bound to be funny. In 2017, there was The Beguiled, and this was an interesting take. It was a remake of a Clint Eastwood movie from like the 70s, so it was kind of an interesting, fresh approach to an old genre. And this also starred Nicole Kidman, Kirsten Dunst, Elle Fanning, and of course Kirsten Dunst is the star of the movie that we will be studying about Marie Antoinette. She plays the title role. And so you may have gathered that Sofia Coppola and Kirsten Dunst have a very successful collaborative relationship, and they've done a number of projects. One of the most important things to note about this film is that it's a travesty. In other words, it's a deliberately false or distorted account of history. This is not meant to be a documentary. This is not even meant to be one of those BBC docudramas that is trying really hard to recapture the reality of the 18th century. No. There are a number of things that are deliberately distorted in order to make the movie more accessible to a 21st century audience. A travesty is created through the use of a technique called pastiche. And pastiche is really just a fancy word for collage, or a blending together of different genres in different time periods. And this is a word that we're going to use in future lectures, so I thought I'd go ahead and start that conversation now. But let me give you one big example of how pastiche is used in Marie Antoinette. So if you look at this scene, this is a still shot from a scene It's actually a montage where they're trying on lots of different clothes. And you might notice something in this shot that doesn't quite look like it belongs. The Converse. Obviously, Marie Antoinette did not have access to Converse sneakers in the 18th century. So this is out of place. This is a meshing together of different time periods. And why did she do this? Well, who do we usually think of wearing Converse sneakers, especially light blue ones? A young teenager, maybe a young girl. And so what Sofia Coppola is doing here is she's drawing attention to the fact that Marie Antoinette is really just a teenager. She's a girl who wants to have fun. So using pastiche in this way, it's one of the factors that creates what's called a travesty or a distorted account of history. Another way that Coppola uses pastiche in this film is through music. So in the beginning of the film, you'll notice that there is a lot of 18th century music, typical French chamber music, like Jean-Philippe Rameau. But then as you get further along in the film, you start to see more contemporary music from the 20th century and the 21st century, like The Cure or Susie and the Banshees or Adam and the Ants. And this, just like with the Converse sneakers, adds an element of contemporary culture. It reminds you that, even though Marie Antoinette lived a long time ago, there's a lot of similarities to the way that she feels and the way that she behaves to the young people of today's culture. Another example of a travesty that you might be familiar with is the musical Hamilton. And we're going to come back to Hamilton in future lectures, but I thought I'd go ahead and start that conversation. But what makes Hamilton a travesty is that it is a story about real figures from the American Revolution, Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson and so on, and they are telling the story through hip-hop music and dance, which clearly was not around during the American Revolution. So again, that's another example of how pastiche is used to create a travesty or a deliberately false or distorted account of history. Sofia Coppola was the director of this film, but she is also the auteur of this film, meaning that she controlled the mise-en-scène. She was a very hands-on director, and she was had very clear ideas about how she wanted the visual elements to come together to make meaning. So let's look at some of the choices that she made in terms of mise-en-scène. So first, let's look at actors. Sofia Coppola made a lot of really interesting choices with the actors in this film, and that they're not typically what you would expect from a period piece or like a historical kind of movie. These are not stuffy BBC actors and actresses, but they're more like pop culture figures. They're more comedic, they're more lighthearted in nature. And we'll start with the title role of Marie Antoinette was played by Kirsten Dunst. Now, I don't know about you, but when I think of Kirsten Dunst, the first movie that pops into my mind is Bring It On. That movie from the 90s that was about cheerleaders, and it's really cute and really fun and not very deep, but it's entertaining. But that's kind of how I think a lot of people think of Kirsten Dunst. She is bubbly and sweet and young, and she's that cheerleader, life of the party kind of a person. Not necessarily the first person that comes to mind when you think of a queen from the 18th century, right? So why did she make that choice? Well, I think what she's really emphasizing here is that she's just like she did with the Converse sneakers and just like she did with her music choices. I think that she's trying to make an analogy between the world of Versailles and today's contemporary pop culture. She's saying, Marie Antoinette was just a teenager. She was just a young girl who wanted to have fun. And by casting Kirsten Dunst in that role, she's immediately bringing all that subtext. She's bringing all that meaning into the movie before anyone even says one word. The actors that you choose bring a certain history and a certain feel to the production. You also see this with the person that she chose to play King Louis XVI, Jason Schwartzman. And if you're not familiar with his work, he was in Rushmore and the Darjeeling Limited, and he has this very specific kind of comedic deadpan sense of humor. And I thought that it was a really funny choice. Instead of picking someone who was very serious and very king-like, she picked someone who was a little bit more goofy and a little bit more funny. Um, and I think that he captured that role very well. Um, instead of thinking of Louis XVI as being kind of this powerful man, you really kind of get a sense for he's just kind of a kid who's a little socially awkward. And Jason Schwartzman was the perfect person to convey that feeling. I also thought it was really interesting that Sofia Coppola chose these two actresses to play some of the smaller characters. You recognize Molly Shannon from Saturday Night Live. She's the superstar girl, right? And she's just really silly and crazy and a very comedic actress. And you would never immediately jump to, okay, well, she should play a courtier at Versailles in the 18th century. It just doesn't quite fit. So by casting Molly Shannon and by casting Moaning Myrtle from Harry Potter, right? She's bringing in some more comedic elements, some a more fresh, modern feel into the movie. So we've looked at actors. Now let's look at another element of mise-en-scène, and that's color. Color plays a huge role in the overall look of this film. And so it shifts at different points throughout the film and kind of gives you some clues as to what's happening in the plot and how the tone changes at different points throughout the movie. So in the beginning, when Marie Antoinette is still in Austria, in the Austrian court, you see a color palette that is much more subdued and restrained. You see a lot of grays and muted blues, which kind of reveals the more conservative and subdued atmosphere in the Austrian court. Then, by the time she gets to Versailles, you see a whole new color palette, a much more vibrant pastel kind of color palette. And Sofia Coppola specifically was aiming to remind us of French macarons, French pastries, in her choices of color. So you see this in costumes, you see this in props. All of the pastries that you see throughout the film kind of have this color palette. All of the decor in Versailles, really helps to establish this fantasy world that's full of sweets and candy and pastry. And then there are also different points in the film where you see a lot of blacks being used. So like during the masquerade ball, for example, or when she's in mourning at the end of the film. And of course, this creates a sense of mystery, a sense of foreboding, a sense of mourning. You also see there are particular moments in time where you see a more royal color palette. You see a lot of royal blues and royal red colors. And in these moments, this is when Marie Antoinette and King Louis are putting on more of a public persona. They're playing their role as the royal family. But when they're in their private time, especially when Marie Antoinette isn't having her private moments with her friends, that's when you see kind of her fantasy world, her fantasy world full of cakes and sweets and macarons. Another element of mise-en-scène to really pay attention to in this movie is lighting. And in particular, I want you to watch for a type of lighting known as high-key lighting. And high-key lighting is when the lighting is not just very bright, but it's almost borderline too bright. And it's just like with the pastel colors that were reminiscent of the macarons. The high-key lighting creates a sense of a fantasy world, that we're living in a false reality that is almost like her dream. It's almost like her little perfect bubble where everything is beautiful and sweet. We've been talking about how the elements of mise-en-scène are used to construct meaning in a work of film. What do I mean by meaning? Let's maybe talk about that a little bit. And so one way of describing the meaning in a work of art is you could use the word theme. And just like you would talk about themes in a work of literature or themes in a painting, you can talk about themes expressed in a work of cinema. And that's basically just referring to the ideas and the statements that are being made in kind of what topics are being explored. And motifs are little visual elements that help remind you of those themes. So, for example, in this movie, one of the major themes is excess, frivolity, wastefulness. And this is a very prevalent theme in this movie because, of course, that was one of the main things that Marie Antoinette is known for, is her wastefulness and just kind of doing whatever she wants and enjoying the pleasures of life without really thinking about the needs of her people and her country. So those are the themes, right? Those are some of the themes expressed in this movie, and the motifs are little visual elements that help remind us of that theme. And there's lots of examples of this throughout the movie. One big one is food, especially sweets and pastries. And every time you see a sweet or a pastry or a cake or some sort of decadent food display, it's a reminder of that wastefulness. It's a reminder of that theme that's being explored. Another motif that helps remind us of this theme is shoes. And there's one scene in particular where there are a lot of shoes. Another motif that helps underscore the theme of wastefulness is references to gambling and champagne. So one of the things that Marie Antoinette is famous for is that she enjoyed gambling. So imagine that you are a peasant living in 18th century France, and your queen, Marie Antoinette, is just recklessly spending money on gambling. Meanwhile, you don't have enough food to feed your family. And just imagine how insulting that would be, how offensive that would be. So gambling became this important flashpoint within the 18th century culture. It was a symbol of her egregious, wasteful behavior. So you'll see a lot of references in the movie to her gambling habit. And, just little poker chips, those are motifs. Every time you see a poker chip, that's a little motif that's reminding you of the larger theme of wastefulness. So if I had to pick one major theme of the film, I think it would probably be the theme of wastefulness and frivolity. But there's plenty of other ones. There's infinite supply. But another big one that I hope you'll notice is there is the theme of Marie Antoinette feeling imprisoned by her life at Versailles. That even though she's surrounded by luxury and wealth, that she actually feels very confined and restrained and restricted. And that she feels like she has no control over her own life. And this causes her a lot of anguish. And really is that, I think the argument that the film is making is that it's her feelings of being constrained that actually cause her to behave in undesirable ways. Let's think about the ways that Sofia Coppola helps to convey that theme of imprisonment. There's a lot of different ways that she accomplishes this. So looking at this particular still shot from the film, you can see how the mise-en-scène, right, the visual elements are composed in such a way that really emphasizes that this world that's full of luxury and beauty and delicious food is actually kind of overwhelming to this one young girl. She's surrounded by all this delicious food, but it's taller than she is. It's kind of engulfing her. And even though she's surrounded by a bunch of people, she's sitting there all alone with no one to talk to. She can't even make choices about the simplest things, like where to set her glass on the table. This screenshot, I think, really conveys that feeling of imprisonment. I really think this is a very powerful scene where Marie Antoinette has just read a letter from her mother, where her mother is criticizing her for not being pregnant, and this is all your fault, and you need to get it together and figure out how to make this happen. And she's feeling very overwhelmed and pressured, and here she is standing against the wall. And when I see this scene, I really notice how her dress is a floral pattern, and the wallpaper behind her is a floral pattern, very rococo, as we've discussed in previous lectures. And it's almost like she's melting into the wall. It's almost like the wall is grabbing hold of her and engulfing her. And she's nothing more than a piece of decoration. Coppola further develops this theme through her choices with camera position. So, for example, in this scene, again, she's feeling Marie Antoinette is feeling very distressed. She's feeling a lot of pressure. Everyone is angry with her because she's not pregnant yet. And meanwhile, her sister-in-law had a baby. Why isn't she having a baby? And she feels this immense pressure on her. And you really get a sense for that intensity of her emotion through the position of this extreme close-up. Now, if this scene had been filmed from further back, it wouldn't have had that same emotional intensity. So it was that one choice that really made a big difference in terms of developing the theme of feeling imprisoned. You also see it in this screenshot. I think there's a lot of shots. It's kind of, you can watch for that throughout the movie, where you really see the immensity of Versailles. You see how big it is. And we've talked about how big this palace is, and how she is just getting lost in this massive world that is beyond her control. And she's all alone. She has her servants with her, but they're a few paces behind her. They'll never really be her real friends. She can't really have real friends because she's the queen. And to be the queen is a very lonely place. So from using this long shot, Coppola really helps to develop that theme. Placing Marie Antoinette within the context of Versailles, you see the camera movement zooming out in this one scene where, at first she's tightly framed within the shot, and then as the camera zooms out, you really start to see the larger picture of Versailles, and you see how tiny Marie Antoinette is and how it's completely overwhelming and engulfing her. Those are just a couple of the themes that are very prevalent in this film, but there's lots more. And I hope that you will notice other themes, and you will notice the motifs that are used to develop those themes. You will notice how Coppola used elements of mise-en-scène, and she used editing techniques and different cinematic techniques to develop the themes. I just want to draw your attention to a few of the things that we talked about in class related to Marie Antoinette's biography, and I thought that it might be fun to see how they're portrayed in the film. So I just want you to watch out for a few things. First of all, you've got Princess Lamballe. Remember, she was the one who, after Marie Antoinette was imprisoned, and when people associated with the royal family were getting their heads chopped off left and right, Princess Lamballe got her head chopped off, and they put it on a stake, and they put her head up to Marie Antoinette's prison window and forced her to kiss her friend's head. Ah. So anyway, so this is the actress that plays Princess Lamballe, close friend of Marie Antoinette. This is the Contessa de Polignac, and she was also a close friend of Marie Antoinette, and she was featured in a lot of the propaganda, the pamphlets that, she was accused of having lesbian relationships with these two women, and that these women just did nothing but bring her into debauchery. They were bad influences, basically. You'll notice that Joseph II, Marie Antoinette's brother, makes an appearance, and he's the one who kind of gave them a pep talk and helped them understand the whole birds and the bees situation. And Joseph II he was the Emperor of Austria, and Mozart worked within his court. So just wanted to draw your attention to that. Of course, we see Leonard, the hairdresser, and he has one big scene in the middle in the I Want Candy montage scene, but you'll see him in different party scenes, like he kind of keeps one lady from getting her hair caught on fire. Remember how we talked about women with the poof had all kinds of hazards associated with their hairdos, and he's always kind of loitering around in the party scenes, making sure that women stay safe and that their hair looks good. You might see there's a very brief showing of Elizabeth Vigée Lebrun, the portrait artist of Marie Antoinette, and here you see her from the back, and then you also see her paintings, they're replicas of her paintings, and I'll be honest, they're not very well done replicas. I kind of think they look really horrible in the movie, but that's just my opinion. But you do get a sense for how the portraits of Elizabeth Vigée Lebrun contributed to or reflected the progression of Marie Antoinette's public image as time went by. Of course, you see Count Fersen, Marie Antoinette's romantic love interest, and in the film, they go all the way. Historical evidence leaves us in the dark about that. We don't know if they ever really consummated their relationship or if it was more of like a flirtatious romantic relationship. We don't know. You see references to the Petit Trianon. Remember the little village, the little place where she kind of wanted to pretend to be a peasant person, and she kind of pretended to live like a peasant and a farmer, and she wore her muslin dress. You see Marie Antoinette in the garden reading Enlightenment philosophy. She's reading Rousseau with her friends at the Petit Trianon, just exploring these revolutionary ideas without fully understanding the implications of how her lifestyle is not congruent with these philosophies. So you really see the irony there of that. There's one brief mention of Marriage of Figaro, which I think is, you should definitely watch out for that, where they're sitting at a party and the Countess de Polignac says, "Oh, have you seen Marriage of Figaro? It's the best thing I've seen all year. The servants take over the house. It's madness." So you really get a sense for how, again, they were just clueless about how they were attracted to these cultural ideas that were swirling about related to the Enlightenment, and they didn't see the disconnect between the way that they were living and the way that and the philosophies that were being espoused. You see references to all of the propaganda and all the pamphlets that were going around that were creating all these rumors of her bad behavior, and some of which were rooted in truth, but a lot of them were really exaggerated or just kind of bold-faced lies. And of course, the most famous one that you've probably heard of is that she supposedly said, "Let them eat cake." And in the movie, you see her kind of refuting that, saying, "I never said that. That's ridiculous." And it's one thing to notice about that particular scene is that you really see the high key lighting turned up even more than it is in any other part of the movie, which kind of highlights that they're showing you a scene that is even more false. At the end, you kind of see how the public opinion of Marie Antoinette starts to deteriorate. People don't clap for her when she goes to the theater, and she's puzzled by this. Why do they not like me anymore? She's just kind of oblivious. You see the Women's March of Versailles that took place on October 5th and 6th of 1789. You also see a little bit of ballet, and you get a sense for the court dances. So one last little tidbit that I wanted to offer you is about the Bechdel test. So here's a cartoon that illustrates what the Bechdel test is. And it was a cartoon that was drawn by an artist named Alison Bechdel. She's well known in pop culture. The Bechdel test is essentially a rule that she made up. It's not like an official thing or anything, but it's this idea of, is a movie have more than one female character? And do those two female characters talk about something other than a man? So you would be surprised at how few movies actually meet that criteria. But her idea is that a movie isn't worth seeing unless it meets that criteria. So I want you, as you're watching Marie Antoinette, I want you to ask yourself, does it pass the Bechdel test? I hope I've given you a lot of food for thought related to Marie Antoinette, the film, and given you some things to watch for and given you a head start on how to analyze this film, how to dissect it, how to determine how the elements of mise-en-scène and the cinematic devices were used to construct meaning. And there's so much more here that can be said. This is just really scratching the surface, but I hope this helps get you started, and I hope that you enjoy watching the movie with a critical eye.